welcome to another episode of History Hack. Before we start going with our fabulous guest today, we've got to do a bit of housekeeping. You can head over to our website on www.historyhack.co.uk where you can find bios, merch and all sorts of things like that, and fabulous cartoons drawn by our fabulous Steve. You can also give us a one-off donation. I need those one-off donations because, like I said, book habits, I still need to buy bookshelves and my dogs eat for God knows whatever. And I also like to buy a horse. I blame Kate Vigas for that one. You can head to ko-fi.com/historyhack, or you can also be one of our Patreon supporters if you really super like us, because like I said, I'd love to buy that horse. And you can find that on www.patreon.com/historyhack. And I think I'm just going to let Chris make our introductions today because I think he's quite excited about this one. Chris, who have we got on today?
Hello. Two things that people should know that I absolutely adore in this world, beyond my kids. One of them is, of course, you, Alina, and the other one is wandering around the Medway Estuary looking at defences. I'm really happy to introduce Chris Kolonko-Weet, who is an archaeologist who specialises in Second World War anti-invasion defences and pillboxes, which is what he's here to talk to us today about.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris and Alina, for having me. Yeah, so like Chris said, I'm gonna ramble on for about 40 minutes and hopefully not bore you all to death when talking about anti-invasion defences and pillboxes and all that stuff. So yeah, great to be here.
I might need some help though. I'm not very good at this part of archaeology. Give me like a trowel to dig in with ancient history and Pompeii and shit. Then I can do it. But
anything that's not buried, you're a bit lost with.
No, well, yeah, probably actually, yeah. No. Wait, actually, I'm lying. I got to play in some really fun bunkers, so that kind of counts as archaeology, really, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Well, there you go. So I got to play in bunkers in the south of Poland for National Geographic, so that was kind of fun. Nice. Anyway, I'm gonna make Chris start because not this Chris, the other Chris. This is going to be really good.
Yeah. Just say Chris K or whatever. Yeah.
A, B, and C.
A, B, and C.
Or Ginger Chris.
Yes.
Ginger Chris.
Ginger Chris. Beardy Chris. Oh, we both got
Chris.
beards.
Exactly, Beardy Chris. Right. Ginger Chris, please go first.
Well, is that me?
No.
Because I'm ginger as well. This doesn't work.
I was going to say nerdy Chris, and then that just doesn't work either.
Yeah, that doesn't work either.
German Chris? That's the other thing I've been called.
I was born in Germany as well, so... Dad was in the army, so I ended up being born in Germany.
The two of you are useless right now for me.
Do you want to just number us?
Okay. Chris Sams will be Chris 1.
Yep, okay.
Chris 2 will be you.
Okay, that makes sense. Cool.
So we're going to start with Chris 1. Now that we've hashed this all out, Chris 1, you might as well start with the questions, please. Go for it.
Maybe we should start at the beginning and explain sort of what we mean by anti-invasion defences.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so in this respect, during the Second World War, we're going to focus specifically on the UK. So if there's anyone outside of the UK, I'll hopefully set the scene a bit more for you later on. But in terms of anti-invasion defences, these were essentially structures built to defend the UK, especially during the Second World War, against what was often a perceived and even a real threat of invasion during the Second World War. So these structures that were constructed formed essentially what were a range of prepared battlefields which focused on the coastal and inland areas of the UK and comprised extensive amounts of defences that were established essentially from almost the outbreak of war in 1939 up until around 1942. So the period where these defences were built is, in 1940 and 1941 is relatively well known, but they have a much longer shelf life in terms of the history of the Second World War. So yeah, that's what I talk about, what I mean when I'm talking about anti-invasion defences. But within the anti-invasion defences, there were a range of structures which we'll kind of look at today in this podcast. And also things like defended towns, villages and cities, a whole range of stuff going on. And then kind of today, some of these structures that were built for defence against invasion actually still survive. And often the most recognised or easily recognised of these is the pillbox, which is kind of like a small reinforced concrete structure from which soldiers would sit within and shoot outside and kill the enemy, hopefully. And although these are relatively well known and identified today, we still know very little about them. So yeah, when it comes to anti-invasion defences, the term actually covers a whole range of structure types, especially in archaeology, and a vast amount of history as well in a relatively short period of the Second World War. So hopefully that clears that up.
I don't know, does it, Chris? One?
Yeah, like I say, my great grandfather was building them around the Medway
Oh,
towns in 1940,
nice.
and there's a huge amount of different types. If anyone's from Medway and they know the old Chatham Town Hall, there was a large concrete block in the middle of the road, and that was him. Um,
Wow,
stop the Panzers.
that's really cool.
Um, if you go out but there's so many different types of pillbox as well, because you've got I was wandering around All Hallows, and there's an artillery one, and and
Oh
two
yeah,
machine gun. And the artillery one's facing inland, and the machine gun ones are facing out to the river.
ooh,
And and Sheerness, just down the river from me, was the most
yeah.
fortified place in the world in the First World War.
Oh
And
yeah, it was. Yes.
it's still got, and all the defences were reopened again for the Second World War. And there's so many different types.
Yeah.
Takes
So
quite a
there
lot of
is.
wandering around.
When you look at the entirety of the UK, there's just such variation in defence types, and not just pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, and a whole range of other defence types. There's no kind of like one size fits all defence type. Wherever you go in the UK, you'll find like almost a localized design, and yeah, there's a lot of variation in the UK, which kind of, in terms of archaeology, makes it really quite difficult to try and tell a one size fits all narrative, because there was so much variation in defence and strategy during the Second World War in the UK.
Yeah, and you also get evolution of design as well, don't you? I
Yeah.
used to hang around in the Royal Engineers Museum archives, and they've got
Oh, nice.
books on on how to build a pillbox and what you need to do with this and what you need to do to this. So, how did the structures evolve during the conflict?
Well, we see quite a bit of evolution over a relatively broad period of time. In terms of structures, I'll cover that in a bit, in terms of how the structures themselves evolved, because there is quite an interesting story about how pillboxes became obsolete in that regard. But in over, let's say, the course of the from 1939 up until like late 1940, there was a significant amount of evolution in terms of not only defensive defense types, but also defensive strategy and methodology for defending the country as well. So, like I said earlier, a lot of people know about the period 1940 following the fall of France in terms of the invasion threat, but the actual preparations for, well, to thwart invasion essentially were started as early as I think it was October 1939. So literally after a month of the war being declared, the first plan to defend the country against invasion was put into place, and this was known as the Julius Caesar plan. And this saw like a large section of the East Coast, including East Anglia, Yorkshire, and Lincolnshire, and in particular, parts of Essex and the Medway coast, and the mouth of the Thames. And it was kind of like at the outbreak of war that we see a lot of the defensive positions focusing on trenches and the deployment of regular, in particular, territorial army troops to defend sections of the coast as well. And they would like set up essentially First World War style trench systems on the coast. And the idea there was to essentially like deny vulnerable sections of the coast to the enemy if they just randomly turned up and tried to invade the UK, but also as well in terms of fortifying vulnerable ports on the East Coast as well. So way before the fall of France, there were defensive measures put in place essentially at the outbreak of the Second World War. As we move into 1940, this is when we start to see the first pillboxes being built. So in about June 1940, coinciding with the fall of Norway and Denmark, and then later the lowland countries and France, this is when pillbox construction starts up. As Chris had already said as well, or Chris One had said, a lot of defences were built for anti-invasion purposes during the First World War as well. And this is largely overlooked in a story for another time. But a lot of these Second World War defences actually followed the sites and the areas of landscape that the Second World War defences First World War defences were built as well. But it's after the fall of France where construction of defences really kicks up a notch. We see vast amounts of pillboxes built, and the defensive strategy around June, July 1940 focuses specifically on what were termed stop lines. These are like linear lines of defence following easily defended locations like the river and canal network and places where road and rail networks converge and things like that. But this very quickly evolved into a secondary defensive strategy. So officially, stop lines were only used as a defensive strategy for the months of July and August 1940. Although today they get a lot of attention, they were extremely temporary. And in some cases, although the defensive strategy of stop lines had officially been halted in August, construction did continue up until early 1941. But as a defensive strategy, stop lines were extremely temporary. So this initial stop line strategy was then further evolved into what was termed a nodal point defensive strategy, where essentially towns and villages and places where the road and rail network would be essentially just absolutely covered in defences. And the idea was that this would deny the road and rail network to the invading force. So we see this evolution over the space of 1940 happening relatively quickly. Obviously, today we know that the invasion didn't come in 1940, so this gave a bit of a respite over the winter to the home forces. And into 1941, we start to see a significant reorganisation and consolidation of the defences. So the defences built within the earlier stop line network, they were rapidly incorporated where possible into the nodal point defences of towns and villages and such. And we also see like new weapon systems introduced, such as the Blacker Bombard, better known as the Spigot Mortar, which is often synonymous now with the Home Guard. This was issued in almost as many numbers to the regular and territorial army and the Royal Artillery as well. And it's by the end of 1941 that, although pillboxes are relatively well known in terms of the anti-invasion defences, the pillbox actually starts to be seen relatively unfavourably. So it's seen as almost a death trap towards the end of 1941, and in some cases, pillbox construction is unofficially halted around August 1940 in some of the commands where these things have been built. Moving into 1942, in February 1942, the pillbox itself as a defensive structure is declared officially obsolete, so construction is halted immediately, and their use is discouraged unless absolutely necessary. So we see a transition or further evolution from the pillbox to the slit trench, where slit trench has become the primary defensive system in use to defend the country. So in this course of like 1940 to 42, we've seen this massive evolution, a massive amount of change, not only in defensive policy, but also in defense types that were built as well. And then you kind of like come towards the end of 1942, and this is when, in December 1942, the threat of immediate invasion is actually deemed to be over. So the anti-invasion defences had a relatively short shelf life of active defence, and were soon kind of like mothballed at the end of 1942 into 1943. At which point, you know, the regular and territorial army start to kind of hand over primary defence to the Home Guard, for example, and this allows the regular and professional soldiers to be trained up to re-invade or invade the continent again, or to be deployed elsewhere across the globe. And then, like I say, essentially by 1943, the threat of immediate invasion is over. So the defences themselves, in a lot of cases, start to be drawn down and in some cases demolished as well. So the anti-invasion defences had quite a quick evolution, but a relatively short shelf life themselves. Coming on to pillboxes, as I've already mentioned, the pillbox was obsolete officially by February 1942. And there's some actually really cool, kind of interesting reasons for this. So first one I've already said was that the pillbox was seen as a death trap. So a pillbox in most cases has a single entrance. Any troops in there, as soon as they come under effective fire, they're essentially trapped. Pillbox also has severe limitations in terms of visibility and peripheral vision over the landscape. So you are essentially confined to observing the landscape through relatively small embrasures, which essentially makes it really difficult to see troops moving in the landscape or enemy troops moving in the landscape to counter them. Second disadvantage of a pillbox is that the pillboxes themselves were constructed to specifications as of 1940. So there were two types of pillbox. Well, the thickness of the walls were based on two specifications. The first was walls of 1 feet thick or 38 centimeters thick were considered to be bulletproof, and pillboxes with thicker walls of 1.6 meters which is about 2 feet, it's more than 2 feet, 4 feet, were considered to be shell-proof as of 1940. As the enemy's weapon system started to increase in power and capabilities, these thicknesses of wall were no longer effective against protecting the garrison inside against incoming artillery and direct fire. And as a result, some pillboxes were provided with what was termed a thickening skirt, or they were thickened by adding the skirt of concrete below embrasure level in an attempt to help them withstand modern weapon systems that were coming into use in 1941 or towards the end of 41. So you get this situation in 1941 where pillboxes, they're trying to thicken the walls of these pillboxes to make them withstand incoming fire, but you get to a point where the walls would have to be so thick that it would not only limit visibility further, but also actually limit the arcs of fire from the machine guns and other weapon systems deployed within the pillbox, making them absolutely useless in the end. So they gave up on the idea of pillboxes because you can only go so far with reinforced concrete before it gets untenable, and the pillbox essentially becomes even more visible and harder to conceal in the landscape. So hopefully that gives you an insight into not only how quickly the defences evolved themselves, but also how quickly pillbox design kind of evolved and then petered out due to obsolescence.
I just want to add a quick comment. It's amazing how England had all of that time to be able to prepare their defences, and
Mm,
most of mainland Europe was just completely and utterly conquered with a matter of literally weeks. And
yeah,
I love this comparison because when we talk about resistance, this is for
yeah,
me the most interesting comparison is how resistance evolved. Where, for example, of course, I'm going to use Poland because it's the one that I work on,
yeah,
is that everything had to be done there, then, and it had to evolve as for example, the Home Army grew. Britain
yeah,
had all of this ample time
yeah.
to prepare themselves, and they ended up getting better equipment, better defenses, and they were ready for this shit basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I always like to see these parallels with what happened on the continent, because, like you say, it was, in Britain. So it wasn't just England; it was the whole, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland were defended as well. But the turnaround in how quickly they reacted to the situation, essentially right at the outbreak of war, and then constantly redeveloping and evolving the defensive strategy. Even as things were happening in France and the invasion was happening, these defenses were being tailored for the situation as it was, and then constantly adapted, reinterpreted, reused to adapt to situations as they evolved elsewhere. It's absolutely phenomenal. And in terms of resistance as well, you also have you know the resistance networks that were established in the UK as well, before, if an invasion happens. So you have a ready-made resistance network in place just in case the invasion arrived. But yeah, it's just when you start to look at the records and the defenses themselves, you just see how quickly they react to the situation, but also how they got it right in terms of defensive types and defensive strategy in a lot of cases as well.
Yeah, I mean, we were also quite lucky that which other countries on the continent didn't have, which was that 22 odd miles of sea between
Yeah,
France and us, which gave us the time to actually build the defences. And I know Alina's going to hate me for saying this, but the sea is so important to Britain, and that 22 odd miles of sea stopped was saved Britain more so than the RAF and the Navy.
yeah, definitely. So yeah, the Channel and also the North Sea as well was probably the best anti-tank barrier that you could possibly get, and it did give that buffer from the Germans rolling straight through France and into the UK as well. I think also as well, it's worth mentioning the wider context as well. So today the South Coast is seen as vulnerable, or the only vulnerable place, but the reality was the first active defences built in the UK were as a result of the fall of Denmark and Norway. So the Shetland Isles sits only, I think, 300 miles away from the coast of Norway, and the key worry was that when Norway fell, that the Germans were going to sail. I think it only takes like 6 hours to sail from there to the Shetland Isles, and the worry was that the Germans would immediately push through the Shetland Isles and take Scapa Flow and then push through Scotland as well. So, although we've got the channel as well, the invasion threat was also much more extensive as well. But that did buy a lot of time. The Germans clearly weren't prepared for invading the UK, especially in 1940. and I think they were expecting Britain would capitulate relatively quickly after the fall of France.
So yeah, going back to the First World War, again, because that's where my head's at the moment. Where was the first place the Germans attacked by sea? The North, Hartlepool, Scarborough. They're the first places that
Yeah,
get bombarded. It's
yeah,
easy.
exactly. And was it shortly after? Well, in fact, pretty much immediately after that, the bombardment of Scarborough, there were defences been thrown up in the streets of Scarborough and barricades because the worry was that there'd be a follow-up invasion.
Yeah.
So there's some really nice pictures taken on. I can't remember the road in Scarborough now. But if anyone knows Scarborough, it's near the Hornby toy shop, the train shop there in Scarborough, and there was a barricade thrown up on that street of sandbags and bits of furniture and stuff almost as soon as the bombardment had finished, because there was a key fear that the Germans were just going to land immediately and invade. And like you say, that's a really decent parallel, is that?
Mm. Not before I want to drag us all down that rabbit hole. Because I will. So who was in charge of the British Home Forces, and who was responsible for the defence network?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That so I'll just quickly explain. So the Home Forces were the military organisation responsible for defence of the UK, essentially. During the Second World, they were established first time round in the First World War for exactly the same task of defending the UK. And during the Second World War, the role was reprised, and the responsibility of the Home Forces, or the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces, was to plan the defence of the UK, train troops that were deployed in the UK, and also equip them as well. So the role of being in charge of the Home Forces fell upon the shoulders of what was termed the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. And in the period from 1939 to late 1941, there were several of these. There was a relatively high turnover of them during the main period of the Second World War. So at the outbreak of war in 1939, the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces was a chap called General Walter Kirk. And his role in the Home Forces is massively overlooked today, even though he was vitally important to the preparation of defending the UK, ensuring troops were available, ensuring they were equipped, and also key to forming things like the Home Guard. But his role in that is completely forgotten. So Walter Kirk was the kind of like the key character from 1939 to May 1940, and he got the ball rolling in terms of providing resources for the defence of the UK through the Home Forces, and making sure that I think about 9 divisions of the regular and territorial army were deployed across the UK in these initial stages of the war, while the Julius Caesar plan was underway. So following the fall of Norway and Denmark and the commencement of the invasion of lowland countries and France, Walter Kirk was very quickly put into retirement. He was chucked out of the position of Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, and he was the word's gone now. What's the word? He was replaced by General Edmund Ironside. So Ironside is relatively well known for the stop line strategy that he devised. And he had a very short tenure as the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces. So he was essentially dropped into the position, given this unenviable task of preparing the country for what was, at the time, imminent invasion, or what was seen as imminent invasion. And he was given the massively unfavourable task of rebuilding the regular and territorial army troops that had been pulled out of France through Operation Dynamo and Operation Cycle and Ariel. So Dunkirk wasn't the only evacuation. There were multiple evacuations from France. And he had essentially a ragtag force of really poorly equipped soldiers to quickly retrain, redeploy to defend the country immediately. And he also had the unenviable task of developing a defensive strategy, and a viable defensive strategy at that, based on the lessons learned in France. And this is where he devised this stop line strategy. So given the lack of resources he had, his only option really was to focus on what was seen, or what is seen today as, static defense of vulnerable points in the landscape. So he built these linear stop lines where the limited resources and limited troops at the time could be concentrated into defending these key areas in the landscape. So you come to early July 1940, and Edmund Ironside has fallen out of favour with the War Department, and he himself is put into early retirement and replaced by General Alan Brooke. Brooke had seen fighting in France recently, had a really good understanding of how the Germans were implementing combined arms warfare, and also conveniently, by the time he took over the defence, he had access to much better resources. So a lot of the weapons that had been lost in France and the fighting in France had started to be replaced. So he had better troops and better equipment to play with. And he completely got rid of the stop line strategy, replaced it with a strategy focusing around what were termed nodal points. So these are, towns and villages where the road and rail network converges. And the idea is that you can easily deny the landscape and the road network and the rail network to the invading force, which would slow them down and lead them to getting bogged down, where eventually a counter-attacking stroke could be deployed. So Alan Brooke essentially modified and started to change the existing defensive strategies of Kirk and Ironside, and he formed a more modern defensive strategy which continued to develop up until late 1941. So Brooke himself was promoted to the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial General Staff, I think it was, in December 1941. So his defensive strategy and his work was seen very favourably, and he was promoted and replaced by someone called General Bernard Paget. And Bernard Paget was kind of like the final commander-in-chief of Home Forces, who had a responsibility over the anti-invasion defences. So by the time he was moved on, I think he was moved to the Far East in January 1944, the defences, the anti-invasion defensive network had ceased to exist and was no longer needed. But he kind of oversaw the drawing down of the regular and territorial army troops to be deployed elsewhere, the training of the Home Guard to take on a more prominent role in defence. So you have these four main characters who each could have a presentation and a podcast of their own, just looking at their history and general intricacies and how they attempted to deploy the Home Forces and defend the UK. So it was the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces that was in charge of defending the UK, and there were four main ones of these: Kirk, Ironside, Brooke, and Paget, who are the key ones to focus on. As you move below the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces, this is where things start to get extremely complex. So we first need to understand that the UK itself was divided up into a series of commands. So you have Northern, Eastern, Southern, and Western Command, as well as Scottish commands, and then you've got like Northern Ireland Defended Area and London Defended Area, and these are like administrative boundaries in which a set command structure is in place. And it's because of these like localized commands that we see a huge range of variation in not only defense type but also defense strategy as well. So when we get below the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, you get your commands. That is then subdivided into what were termed corps, and generally you had two corps in a command, and then each corps had 3 divisions under it, and this kind of like hierarchy of command continues all the way down to section level, which the section is the equivalent to what's more commonly known today through American parlance as the squad. And the section is like 8 to 10 troops. So this chain of command goes all the way from the command general at the top, Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, all the way down to the bodies of troops to this section level. So there's a huge amount of responsibility across the UK for defence. But by and large, this responsibility, especially on land, fell to the regular and territorial armies. So these were the 2 arms of the professional infantry that were formed to fight the war, and it was no doubt and obviously quite clear that it was on their shoulders that it fell to defend the UK against an invasion as well. And also alongside the land forces, you had obviously the Home Guard, who are very well known today, but they were essentially a secondary auxiliary force, and they were by no means at the forefront of the country's defence in the period 1940 to 41. It was not until much later in the war that they took on primary defence, generally around 43, 44. Alongside the land forces, you also have things like the Royal Artillery. So you have coastal artillery batteries, which would have been the kind of tip of the spear when it comes to defending the land, and coastal artillery batteries would have fired on enemy shipping. You have field batteries of the Royal Artillery and land, who would have bombarded the beaches where the infantry were landing. and a whole range of artillery resources available to the defence of the UK as well. Coming onto the air, RAF Bomber and Fighter Command would have been key to defending the UK as well. And even if Fighter Command had been wiped out, there would have been still a presence in some form. In some cases, they would have been tasked with dropping poison gas and gas on the beachheads where the enemy were landing. Bomber Command would have been tasked with bombing the beachheads and, inflicting as much casualty and destruction on the invading force from the air as possible. And then moving out to sea, you have things like Coastal Command, which was responsible. It's essentially the Air Force of kind of the Air Force associated with the coast. And they would have provided an early warning for the invading fleet coming in. They'd have also attacked the invading fleet out to sea. And also you had the Royal Navy as well mounting patrols in the North Sea and in the Channel coast as well, who would have also been key to attacking the invading fleet and also any subsequent supply vessels coming in as well. So there was a large amount of responsibility for defence, and the network itself was occupied and garrisoned by a whole range of troops, not just infantry, but also a whole other forces, including the RAF and various air forces and the Royal Navy as well.
I had this sudden urge to talk about Operation Banquet.
Oh, I've not come across it. Which one's that?
That was the one where they were getting Tiger Moth biplanes out of the training school,
Ah,
strapping them with bombs, and then they had other ones where they were fitting them with them and Lysanders with long, sharp blades, so that
yeah.
as paratroopers fell, they could fly through and cut them to pieces.
Yes, yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that because I'd heard about the Tiger Moths been armed with small bombs and grenades and stuff, but I didn't realise it was Operation Banquet. I'm gonna have to look into that now. That's really cool.
And there was a second one whose name I can't remember, where it was basically any civilian aircraft. They were looking at
Yeah,
being able to fit them with bombs as well. It was and
right.
there was a Lysander squadron up in Scotland that they were fitting to carry poison gas, but as
Ah,
a just in case, they did some tests and things apparently.
yeah.
Pretty
Oh, that's
dumb.
really cool. Right, I know I'll be looking at after this.
I think we probably covered a good chunk of this already, but what are the key components of the defensive network?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. This I could go on for this about this for a very long time. But as I've already outlined, let's focus on the defensive strategies in place first. So there were two main defensive strategies used for anti-invasion defense, and the first of these was, like I've said, the well-known stop line strategy, which is associated with General Ironside. And then there was but as I've already mentioned, this was massively temporary and officially only lasted for a total of 2 months, although in some areas it continued in use up until like February 1941. And this initial linear defensive strategy was then superseded by the nodal point defences under Alan Brooke. Something I forgot to mention in terms of stop line strategy, but this often goes overlooked in itself, is that the stop line strategy itself wasn't static. It wasn't purely static. So there were reserve forces at a local level and also at a national level as well, which were deployed by Ironside. So at your division level, you generally have, battalion level, which is a total of about 800 soldiers divided into a battalion. One company, which is 150 soldiers in that battalion, were generally tasked with undertaking some form of mobile counterattack responsibility. And then at a national level, you have the General Headquarters Reserve, or GHQ Reserve, which is this two concentrations of heavily armed mobile troops located well inland, to provide the knockout blow. And these two aspects of Ironside's strategy go massively overlooked, and everyone thinks his defensive strategy is completely static, which is simply not true. And also you have a key part of Ironside's strategy was nodal point defense as well, so defending towns and villages, which was capitalized on later by Alan Brooke. So Brooke's nodal point defensive strategy continues in use all the way up to the end of the defensive measures for anti-invasion. So in terms of these defensive strategies, there were large amount of components that made up these defensive networks that were deployed under these two main defensive strategy. So today, as I've already mentioned, the pillbox gets pretty much all the attention, but the pillbox itself is one aspect of this defensive network. So when we see a pillbox in the landscape today, generally what we don't see are the supporting defences such as slit trenches and weapon slits, things like barbed wire entanglements and obstacles, which obviously were removed after the end of the Second World War, after the defences fell out of use. So the pillbox itself sat within a much wider defensive landscape consisting of trenches and barbed wire obstacles and things like that. Also, we don't see the number of troops deployed in the landscape as well. And this is something I'll cover later on. But the number of troops was deployed to defend the UK was actually much larger than many people actually realise as well. But we'll cover that at a later date. So yeah, by far the most readily recognised component of the defensive landscape or the defensive network were pillboxes themselves. But also things like you had roadblocks, which were a key part of halting the movement of enemy vehicles, not just tanks, but also trucks and armoured fighting vehicles and reconnaissance vehicles. So the idea with the roadblock is you stop the tank or other vehicle from moving so you can attack it more efficiently. And once it stops in its tracks, a tank is essentially dead if it can't move and continue to be mobile. Alongside this, you also have vast amounts of anti-tank obstacles. So anti-tank blocks, as we heard earlier, these were deployed in the thousands. You get many types of anti-tank blocks. So you get the big concrete cubes, you get the little pyramids, which are often called dragon's teeth, but were officially called pimples, which isn't quite as romantic. You get Z1 scaffolding, a whole range of obstacles erected to slow down, impede, and essentially and hopefully halt the movement of enemy vehicles to slow them down as much as possible as they try to move inland. Yeah, and although the pillbox itself is seen as the primary defensive structure, it was actually outnumbered in most cases by the slit trench. And today the slit trench goes completely ignored, even though it was, in my survey area in Filey Bay, I've recorded something like 40 pillboxes and nearly 100 slit trenches. So you've got a fair amount of trenches within the landscape alongside a pillbox. You also have other things like, as I've mentioned, your mobile reserves, which go overlooked as a key component to the defensive network, and things which don't leave a physical trace, such as places where the enemy would be funneled, like rail and road bridges. So they would have been a key defensive area because, to cross these ready-made anti-tank obstacles, enemy vehicles would essentially be channeled into these predefined areas by the bridges and things like that. So the landscape itself was a key component of defence, which often goes overlooked. Although we have the defensive structures themselves, landscape was just as important as physical defences as in terms of defending the landscape as well. So yeah, a vast range of defensive types, a vast range of defensive structures, and a whole range of weapon systems and the like that went into this defensive network.
Yeah, so it's really quite extensive, isn't it?
Massively so, yeah. Yeah, like I say, when you see one pillbox in the landscape, you're not seeing, the section of infantry that was defending it. You're not seeing the barbed wire, the hundreds and millions of miles of barbed wire that were built. You're not seeing the slit trenches. The defensive landscape was much more extensive than what we see today. And, a key part of archaeology and the investigation and the recording I do is to try and build up this landscape of defense to get a better idea of how extensive it was and how it would have been operated.
Yeah, because someone's done that for the Medway towns. They've actually got an internet website of an interactive map showing everywhere where there was like anti-tank ditches, slit trenches, pillboxes, barbed wire lines, and it just walking around here. I mean, it's where my old house is. Was a tank track, and it's amazing to think of where all this stuff that was there that's no longer there. You would zero evidence of it now.
Yeah, and that's only the stuff that we know about at the minute. There's so much out there which hasn't been identified or recorded because very few people do anything. To be honest, there's very little research going on into this subject as well. So there's still a vast amount of stuff out there to be identified and recorded properly.
But it's something that I think we could go on a lot about, and I think we're going to have to come back and do another one, aren't we?
Well, I don't mind that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Just sort of wrap up a bit. If people wanted to know more about your research or more about the subject in general, what sort of things should they look for?
Recommend, well, you can check out my website. So if you go to chriskolonko.wordpress.com, I've got a fair bit of information about archaeological recording, but also things like pillbox myths. because there are a fair few of those. And there's a surprising amount of mythology surrounding pillboxes today, and even stuff that's taken for granted is often myth. So check out my website. I also recommend checking out the UK Second World War Heritage website, which is a little endeavour set up by myself and Peter Hibbs to try and promote involvement with recording Second World War anti-invasion defences. So that can be found at UK Second World War Heritage.wordpress.com. And I also recommend, if you want to find out more, check out your local historic environment record as well. So your local historic environment record is a local database curated often by the council, which has all the information you need about archaeological and historical sites in your local area. And your local HR is often desperate for information about Second World War stuff, and there's a significant amount of things out there which are commonly known about by members of the public but haven't been recorded with the local historic environment record. And this is vitally important because the HR's data informs the planning process. So by interacting with your local historic environment record and recording stuff, you can help ensure long-term preservation for surviving UK sites. But if you check out UK Second World War Heritage, you'll find all the information on there. My website, follow me on Twitter if you really want to find out more and see some of the boring stuff I get up to. But those are my key recommendations to check out if the listeners want to find out more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got to resist. I've got so many other things to do, but I'm really trying to have to resist diving down that rabbit hole because I love doing that, sort of wandering around here looking for stuff.
Yeah, it's the perfect place for it. I'm quite well catered for in Norfolk, but I'm massively jealous of down that way. Massively jealous.
I'll tweet you some pictures next time I go for a wander.
If you would, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
But yeah, thanks for coming on, and I'm really looking forward to doing a part 2 sometime.
Yeah, no problem at all. Looking forward to it myself.
Thanks, Chris. This has been really, really great. And I could probably sit here for the rest of the night talking to you about pillboxes and defences and all the other cool stuff that will probably drive Alina mad. So it's probably best that we call it there. But just to remind all our listeners that we do have the History Hack website where you can go and check out bios of all of us, information about all of us, as well as maybe head over to the History Hack shop. Not only can you get cool books for cheaper, but you can also get merchandise such as t-shirts, prints, other assorted knickknacks, all drawn by our favourite Beardy Weirdy. If you want to do something a bit more, if you want to say thanks for this episode, you can buy us all a drink. ko-fi.com/historyhack. Or if you want to be one of our favourite people and you want to say thanks, on a regular basis, you can head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/historyhack, and sign up for different perks. There are different levels. I think it goes from as cheap as £1 a month. And of course, you have the selection of Chris perks. My lawyers have come back and said, I would say lawyers. I don't have any lawyers. I can't afford them. My son has looked it over and he said it's fine. Ollie says it's okay for me to take selfies for you or out stupid messages at the end of episodes. There are loads of Chris perks as well as more serious perks. Do go head over to Patreon and see if any of those tickle your fancy. And to finally close, I've reached in onto my bookshelf to pull out one of my favourite books, My 50 Favourite Jokes by Sophie Sams, my daughter, called out. A classic for you. Why did the boy take a pencil to bed? To draw the curtains. So there you go. It's not as funny as I possibly think it is. But again, thank you for listening to the episode. And thank you, Chris, for coming on and talking to us.